During the Vietnam War, the Communists in the North were armed mainly with post-Second World War designed Soviet weapons, while their opponents in the South used almost exclusively post-Second World War American weapons. Some old Second World War era Soviet and American weapons were used by the two sides respectively, and, to a lesser extent, Second World War era French weapons left over from the Indochina War. There were even a few Second World War Japanese guns floating around, left over from the Japanese occupation. Perhaps most surprising, however, were Second World War German designs, which, through a strange combination of politics and necessity, ended up in combat halfway around the world in Vietnam 2 decades after their last use in Europe. The 75mm Pak-40 was a standard anti-tank gun of the Wehrmacht during the Second World War. The weapon weighed 3,142 pounds and fired a 75 by 714mm armor-piercing or high-explosive round out to a range of around 1,820 yards in the anti-tank role of 4 miles when used as a light howitzer. During the Second World War, the Pak-40 was an extremely effective anti-tank gun, capable of taking on the T-34 and the M4 Sherman. In 1955, the Soviet Union transferred a small number of Pak-40 guns to North Vietnam. They had been captured during the Second World War and kept in storage for 10 years afterwards. Prior to being transferred to North Vietnam, the weapons were refurbished. The North Vietnamese did not often employ their Pak-40s in the intended anti-tank role, as they sought to avoid set-piece confrontations with American or South Vietnamese tanks. Additionally, the near-complete air superiority of American warplanes made moving and emplacing towed field guns like the Pak-40 very hazardous. North Vietnam did, however, employ Pak-40 guns in defensive units in the Red River Corridor, including coastal defense batteries along the coast of the Gulf of Tonkin. North Vietnam retired the Pak-40 in 1972, so none were in use during the 1975 final conquest of South Vietnam. Today, one example of the weapon is preserved at the Vietnam Artillery Museum. The MG-34 machine gun was another weapon which found use during the Vietnam conflict. This excellent general-purpose machine gun was the predecessor of the much more famous MG-42. The MG-34 was extremely similar to the MG-42 and every bit as effective. The only real reason the latter gun was developed was that the MG-34 was too expensive. The Wehrmacht used the MG-34 throughout the Second World War alongside the MG-42. The air-cooled MG-34 fired a 7.92mm cartridge from either a 75-round saddle drum or 250-round belts. The North Vietnamese used both methods. The weapon had a rate of fire of 800 rounds per minute and was accurate out to around 2,000 yards. During the Indochina War, fought between 1946 and 1954, the French Foreign Legion had brought a number of ex-Wehrmacht MG-34s into the country, and some of the communist examples could have been leftovers from that conflict. Most likely, the MG-34s encountered by the Americans during the Vietnam War were part of the initial round of military aid from the Soviet Union, which consisted largely of warehoused Second World War weapons, both Soviet and German. The MG-34 was ideal for the Viet Cong, as it was durable, had a good rate of fire against American helicopters, and was easy to maintain. These guns were by no means common, but were not exactly rare during the Vietnam War's early phase in the beginning of the 1960s. The MG-34 was gradually phased out as its German ammunition supply dwindled and greater numbers of DS-HK anti-aircraft machine guns were supplied by the USSR. Examples of the STG-44 assault rifle could also be found in Vietnam. While the STG-44 was not the world's first assault rifle, it was the first mass-produced on a large scale and issued to wartime units in large numbers. Its general layout and concept greatly influenced many modern assault rifles which came after it. The Sturmgewehr, a literal translation of which is storm rifle in German, but meaning assault rifle, was issued to both the Wehrmacht and to the Waffen-SS in the latter phases of the war. It came too late to help Germany, but nonetheless was a very lethal weapon. The STG-44 fired the 7.92 Kurz cartridge from a 30-round box magazine. This cartridge had a muzzle velocity of 2,247 feet per second, and the gun was accurate out to around 300 yards in full auto, or nearly double that in semi-automatic firing. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the STG-44 was not as rare as one might imagine. Despite the relatively small number made before Germany's surrender when compared to examples of the Kar-98 rifle, a disproportionate quantity was retained due to the weapon's modern nature. Tens of thousands were captured by the Soviets in 1945. Later in that decade, some were transferred to the new client regimes in Eastern Europe, most notably to East Germany and especially to Czechoslovakia. By the latter half of the 1950s, these armies had moved on to the SKS and to the AK-47 and began rolling out their STG-44s abroad. North Vietnam's STG-44s came from at least two sources: the Soviet Union, as part of its late 1950s first tranche of military aid, and then a smaller quantity received from Czechoslovakia. It is possible that a very small number were also delivered from East German reserve warehouses during the early 1960s. These guns were never common, but at least very early in the Vietnam War they were not particularly rare either. These guns were rarely seen after the January 1968 Tet Offensive. Perhaps the most surprising weapon that the Americans discovered in North Vietnam's arsenals during the war was the FG-42. The FG-42 was one of the rarest service rifles of the Second World War. The weapon was used exclusively by the Fallschirmjäger and was intended to equip the Fallschirmjäger with a weapon which had machine gun firepower but which was as light as a rifle. The FG-42 was, for its time, a very advanced weapon. It was one of the few Second World War firearms to use plastic furniture, although it may be noted that wood was later substituted. Capable of being fitted with a scope, the FG-42 fired the 7.92mm cartridge from a 20-round box magazine, which was horizontal on the left-hand side. The weapon was advanced in that the magazine could be ejected and hand-loaded with individual cartridges or speed-loaded by running a stripper through the right-hand side of the breech. The center of gravity was aligned so that the FG-42 could be shoulder-fired, effectively making it a very early assault rifle. Approximately 7,000 examples of the FG-42 were produced during the course of the Second World War. Fewer still survived the war, and even fewer still were in existence when the Vietnam War started. The number of FG-42s supplied to the Vietnamese communists had to be incredibly small, and it is astonishing that any even ended up in Vietnam at all. Almost certainly, they were all supplied by the Soviet Union in the late 1950s. These guns were very rarely encountered in the field, although they were present. Ironically, the designers of the M60 machine gun, the main American light machine gun of the Vietnam War, said that they were partially influenced by the layout of the FG-42 when designing the M60 before the conflict. Examples of the MP-40 submachine gun were also to be found in Vietnam. This submachine gun was very common during the Second World War and, along with the Stahlhelm helmet, came to symbolize the Third Reich on the battlefield. The MP-40 fired the 9mm parabellum cartridge from a 32-round box magazine at 500 rounds per minute. Its effective range was low, but as it was intended as a fast-firing, close-in gun, this was not considered important. Tens of thousands of these submachine guns were captured by the Soviets during the Second World War. Along with the Kar 98 rifle, the MP40 was the most common Second World War German firearm encountered by American troops during the Vietnam War. It was also one of the few pieces of Second World War German hardware to be used by both sides. In South Vietnam, most of the MP40s used by the ARVN, and even in some rare instances the US Army, were leftovers from the French arsenal overrun by the Communists during the Indochina War. In North Vietnam, MP40s came from the same source and also from shipments of MP40s captured by the Soviet Union during the Second World War. The MP40 would remain in use throughout the Vietnam War, although by the late 1960s it had largely been replaced by the AK-47 in communist ranks. The forerunner of the MP40, a small number of MP38 submachine guns were also to be found in the ranks of the Viet Cong. The MP38 was much less common than the MP40 and was rarely encountered after the mid-1960s. With a production totaling approximately 14.6 million, the Kar 98 was the most produced German firearm of the Second World War. It was used in every theatre in Europe from 1939 to 1945. The bolt-action Kar 98 was 3 foot 7 inches long and weighed 9 pounds. The rifle fired a 7.92mm cartridge from a stripper-loaded 5-round internal magazine. With the standard open iron sights, the weapon was accurate out to around 550 yards and had excellent stopping power. During the early phases of the Vietnam War, the Kar 98 was fairly common in the ranks of the Viet Cong. These guns came from a number of sources. A small quantity had been shipped to the region by France during the Indochina War and abandoned thereafter. Some were transferred from Czechoslovakia, and later a small quantity were received from East Germany, which had briefly used ex-Wehrmacht Kar 98s captured by the Soviets during the course of the war, which had then been transferred back to East Germany for use. By far the largest source of Kar 98s in the Vietnam War was the late 1950s Soviet arms package. The Soviet Union captured between 1 million and 1.5 million of these rifles in 1945 and actively refurbished them and sent them to communist fighters abroad. The Viet Cong and VPA both used the Kar 98 throughout the Vietnam War, although by the late 1960s it had been largely replaced in VPA service by the SKS and AK-47. Captures of this gun were not at all uncommon to American troops in the early and mid-1960s. As the Second World War era Kar 98 obviously had zero intelligence value by 1960 and was unwanted by either American or South Vietnamese troops, American servicemen were generally allowed to keep captured Kar 98 rifles and to legally import them into the United States when their tour of duty ended. This led to a number of interesting situations where Vietnam-era soldiers captured the same type of rifles as their fathers had captured during the Second World War from German forces. A small number of Walter P-38 handguns were supplied to the North Vietnamese by the Soviet Union in the late 1950s. These were from examples captured from the Germans during the course of the war. They were not common, but did appear from time to time, especially during the early 1960s. The Walter P-38 fired a 9mm parabellum cartridge from an 8-round magazine. Alongside the FG-42, the Mauser C-96 was another surprising part of the Vietnamese communist inventory. The Mauser C-96 was a veteran of not only the Second World War, but also of the First World War. The weapon is commonly called the broom handle due to its grip shape. Firing the 7.63mm Mauser cartridge from a 10-round box magazine, This gun was originally intended as a compact cavalry carbine and came with a detachable shoulder stock which, along with the gun, was designed to fit in a leather carry bag for cavalry troops. For the examples captured during the Vietnam War, all these accessories were usually long since missing, and these were used strictly as handguns during the 1960s. The story of how the Mauser C-96 ended up in Vietnam is quite varied. The Tsarist Russian army had used some examples of the weapon, which were then inherited by the Soviet Union, which itself made a sizable buy of this gun between 1920 and 1921, designated the M1920. Further examples were captured from Poland during the joint German-Soviet invasion in September 1939. As a non-standard weapon by the 1940s, some of these were transferred to reserve warehouses in the Soviet Far East. The Soviet Union's participation in the war against Japan lasted only a matter of days and was entirely offensive in nature, so the defensive emergency guns were never required. The July 1953 armistice, which ended the Korean War, allowed the Soviet Union to undertake an emergency rebuilding of the North Korean army, during which the now long obsolete Mausers were dumped off to North Korea. The North Koreans did not want the weapon and sent some examples to North Vietnam in the 1960s as a way of indirectly harming the United States. Meanwhile, Communist China had produced some examples of the gun in the 1950s. Some of these clones were sent to the North Vietnamese during the course of the Vietnam War. North Vietnam also produced its own Mauser-inspired weapon, which never received a formal designation. It was true to the Mauser's operating system, but had a different shape to ease production.
Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more updates, like and share. You can also help to support the channel at Patreon. Details are in the description box below.